It's a very kind of dark level of sickness of this genocidal regime that they are willing to bomb thousands and kill thousands and drag the entire world into a war just so that they do not have to stop killing the Palestinians. And that's the reality of where we're at, and that's the reality of what the American government is supporting.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, a production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. And today we really are taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. Our guest today is Muhammad Sankari, who's from the United States Palestinian Community Network, where he's a leader and an organizer. Welcome to Fight Back Radio, Muhammad.
Thanks so much, Richard. Thanks for having me, and it's an honor to be here.
Yes, and there's so much to talk about. There's so much going on in the Middle East. But first, let's start out. I want to jump right into it. Let's maybe a little bit of background of we're approaching, as we're recording this, the anniversary of October 7th.
Yeah.
And the maybe if you could talk a little bit about what led up to the October 7th, what's been the situation, a brief history maybe of some of the Zionist occupation of Palestine and the resistance, and where people were at when they launched the counteroffensive on October 7th.
Yeah, so I think that you correctly characterized it there. So there's been a Zionist occupation and colonization of historic Palestine since 1948, starting actually settlements starting before 1948. But in 1948, the state of Israel was declared on ethnically cleansed lands. That was a result of 800,000 of the indigenous inhabitants being kicked off of their home and lands. And many of those people were pushed into this small, 100 square miles, less than 100 square miles strip known as the Gaza Strip. And then again in 1967, when the Israeli occupation expanded into the West Bank and Gaza Strip and the other parts of Jerusalem, and at that point parts of Egypt and Syria and others. Additionally, more people were pushed into Gaza, and so it's this tiny strip of land in if you're looking at a map of Palestine, it's in the southwest corner, bordering on the Sinai Desert of Egypt, and it's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. There are people who are from Gaza, Gaza City, and others, but then there's a very large refugee population as well, and the Israelis had built settlements and actually physically occupied Gaza with settlements as they do in the West Bank up until 2004, I believe, 2005. Should probably know this before I say it. So the Israelis had settlements, and under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon had withdrawn from those settlements, but that led to a complete and total blockade of the Gaza Strip. And so since some elections that were held by the Palestinians in 2006, in which Hamas, one of the political parties, won those elections, since that moment, the Israelis, the Americans, and the Europeans have worked to encircle Gaza and originally illegitimately keeping Hamas from being able to take power of the Palestinian Authority. And then when they seized power in Gaza, then creating this blockade in which land, water, air, sea, everything was controlled. And so that kind of lays the geographic maybe and political foundation of Gaza itself. But broader than that is for years now, we've seen really a consistent ramping up of horrific settler violence across the West Bank, across historic Palestine, the expansion of settlements across the West Bank, people losing their homes and lands, increasing violence, and continued incursions by the Israelis and the extreme right wing into the Al Aqsa Mosque compound. And all of this was kind of boiling over and boiling over. Um, and and there had been multiple times in which there were kind of uprisings. Um, most recently, most recently in 2021, 2022. Um, but then that brings us to kind of October 7th, in which there was a large scale counteroffensive that was carried out by all of the different parties, all the different factions of the Palestinian resistance, which is multiple political parties and their armed wings. And originally it was to capture, it was to essentially break the siege on Gaza, capture a number of soldiers, take them back to Gaza, and then prepare for a prisoner exchange in which they would be able to make political demands, free some of the thousands of Palestinian political prisoners. And was kind of this is what has come to be understood about what the plan was on October 7th. Um, and what we found out, obviously everyone is hindsight is 2020, right? Is there was actually rapid a rapid collapse of the Israeli occupation forces that surrounded Gaza. And the resistance actually was able to continue and just push into historic Palestine. And it was actually days long of battles in which the resistance held territory in the surrounding settlements around Gaza, in which, again, now we know that even the resistance themselves hadn't anticipated that. They thought that there would be fierce clashes around the border of Gaza, again, the capturing of soldiers and then a political exchange. But the situation actually rapidly changed in a way that even they didn't anticipate. Um, and then the Israelis met it with, of course, extreme violence, as we all know. And first and foremost, they enacted what is popularly understood now to be the Hannibal Directive, which is to say that the Israelis have a military procedure or a military directive in which they are told to kill their own people as opposed to allowing them to be captured by Palestinians to prevent Palestinian leverage for political prisoner exchange. And so the Israelis unleashed hellfire on their own people. They bombed them, they shot missiles from helicopters, they completely decimated entire settlement areas, and to kill not only the Palestinian resistance members that were there, but also Israelis who were there. And that's really what happened on October 7th. That's just the stage. Now there's a number of people who were taken back to Gaza, settlers and military personnel. And from the first day, actually, the Palestinian resistance on, I believe it was October 9th, even, the spokesperson of Al Qassam Brigade's Abu Ubaidah said that they are willing to negotiate. They are willing to exchange every single person that was captured for Palestinian political prisoners and a guarantee that Israel would not attack Gaza. And the Israelis said no. At that point, they were more intent on drawing blood and committing massacres than they were about returning the quote unquote hostages, people who had been captured. And then we watched as the entire world has watched, the Israelis unleashed the world's first live stream genocide against the people of Gaza with the expressed goal, as expressed by the Israeli military and political elite, not only to kill as many people as possible, but to force the people of Gaza to leave and push them into the Sinai Desert. It is by all legal definitions, a genocide, right? And here we are almost a year later, at least 41,000 dead. Those are the ones that are confirmed and counted by the Ministry of Health in Gaza. The Lancet Journal has said that more likely the number is closer to 100,000 of people who are killed as a result of this genocide, whether directly killed or killed because of forced starvation, lack of access to clean water, lack of access to healthcare. And this is where we are a year later, right? The Palestinian resistance has said that they have actually accepted a ceasefire proposal put forward by the United States back in July, and the Israelis have refused. And it is clear now that the Israeli government is more interested in killing as many people and prolonging the war as long as possible, as opposed to any other political gains. They're not interested in the return
Let
of
me
their own
interrupt you
people.
there just for a
Yeah.
minute. And so this is really difficult, news for people to hear, but it's been hitting us for a year now, so most of us have heard some of it. And I appreciate you going over this and giving us this recap. But I want to go a little bit about the motivations of the Zionist government of Israel, and for a genocide or whatever. And I think some of this is they see themselves as the Jewish state, and that they want to and the whatever population numbers in places may give them difficulty to declare that. Obviously, people that are occupying the land that they say is theirs from God or whatever. Could you talk a little bit about their motivations? The most rabid Zionists are the ones that run the government, I think. So, but could
Right.
you talk a little bit about why they are doing this? Because it's unthinkable to me to say, how could one human being or even a group of human beings just do this to another? And I mean, it's happened in history, but could you talk a little bit
Right.
about that, Mohammed?
Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of this idea of establishing a state, a Zionist state, which expressly means a state that is only for Jewish people on all of historic Palestine, at least on historic Palestine. There are some in the fringes of the Zionist movement that say that Greater Israel would include other areas such as Sinai, southern Lebanon, parts of Syria, parts of Jordan, even all the way into Iraq, depending on what kind of fringes of the Zionist movement you're talking about or what kind of the extreme. And so it's clear from what we know, based on what the political and military elite of the Israelis have said themselves, that the goals of this genocide are to push all 2 million plus residents of Gaza out, force them into the Sinai desert, kill them, whatever it is. And eventually, they will want to settle white European right wing settlers in Gaza again. They want to return to those settlements. And this is part of the idea. The Israelis have a phrase in Hebrew, which means, uh, a maximum land with minimum Arabs. And this is part of that, part and parcel of this idea.
And this is really, I mean, before the counteroffensive on October 7th by the Palestinians, this was already what was going in place. I mean, you mentioned the Nakba of a little over 75 years ago now, and which displaced a large number of Palestinians. But if you look at who's in the jails, and the settlements aren't just oh, I want to open up. It's not like it is here in the United States where there's some land over there and I buy it and I whatever. This is actually just stealing land, taking it for the express purpose of similar to probably what the happened in the United States with white people and native peoples, where the
Absolutely.
manifest destiny and from sea to shining sea and all that sort of thing, where we wiped out the native peoples that are in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's the same thing, the same thing that obviously we saw in this country, which is one of the most, so far one of the most successful settler colony projects. Same thing that we've seen in other places around the world, whether it was South Africa or it was Algeria or others, in which they're trying to bring settlers in. They kill or forcibly remove the indigenous population and then replace them with settlers that they bring in from around the world.
So okay, so then the motives for the Palestinians on October 7th are existential. It's like if we want to continue to have a country or be a national movement or preservation, um, and so it was this whatever slow whittling, maybe not so slow, but a persistent whittling away of what was going on. And
Right.
so the counteroffensive has been used as a pretext for a genocide where they've killed now. over 40,000. And as you mentioned, the Lancet, which I'll say is a very well respected. I think it's a British medical journal, and it's
Yep.
one of the top ones. So it's not just whatever, some fly by
Yeah,
night
it's
thing.
not like my blog, right? This is one of the most respected international medical journals that specifically has done studies like this. They most famously track that, over 1 million Iraqis were killed as a result of the US invasion of Iraq, right? And so they did a similar study and to track the results of the genocide in Gaza.
So as we're recording here today in early October, the war is just expanded, and
Yep.
so there's been you mentioned the resistance, and maybe you can talk a little bit about who that is, within Palestine and outside. But one of the key fighters against Zionism is historically has been Hezbollah
Mhm.
in southern Lebanon, and recently Israel is whatever started bombing different parts, Beirut, in fact, which is reminded me of I'm old, so I remember 1982 when
Yep.
there was a siege on Beirut. But maybe you can talk a little bit about what's happened recently and what's led up to that, and other players in the region.
Yeah, so not to spend too much time in the past, but just to kind of establish that, Hezbollah is they're a political party, a social organization, and a paramilitary organization that exists in Lebanon. They're members of the Lebanese government, for example. It's I think sometimes it's hard for people in the United States to think about it, but oftentimes in the rest of the world, because we don't have this kind of experience here with like the Democratic Party, it'd be hard to think of the Democratic Party having like an armed wing. But in different parts of the world, political parties will have a political wing, a social wing, an armed wing, all of these sorts of things, right? And so Hezbollah is one of those organizations. It was started by some of the most disaffected, disinvested, oppressed people in Lebanon, which is the Shia sect in Lebanon, historically very poor, historically very disaffected. Um, and so its origins really go back to this kind of movement around protecting, investing in their community, but it's grown exponentially from there. And so the Israelis, as you had mentioned, the siege on Beirut, the Israelis had occupied Lebanon from 1982 all the way to 2000, and Hezbollah played the the most major role in resisting that occupation and successfully forcing the Israelis to withdraw most of Lebanon. They still occupy a small part of Lebanese land called the Shaba Farms, um, but they were forced to withdraw from a vast majority of the occupied land that they held. Um, and they have been historically a thorn in the side of the Israelis. They're also a very strong, we're talking about tens of thousands of members of their armed wing when we talk about Hezbollah. Um, and and so they've, their history and origin is kicking out the Israelis from Lebanon. The Israelis then tried to actually destroy them in 2006, another kind of famous war, maybe some remember, in which the Israelis again lost that war in 2006. They were unable to destroy Hezbollah as an organization. And then since October 7th, Hezbollah said they actually got engaged in the battle on October 8th. And what they said is, we are going to open a front with the Israelis. That's not full-scale war, but is like, you know, kind of a low-grade war, a tit-for-tat return with the Israelis, bombing Israeli military positions, striking Israeli military positions in the north of occupied Palestine on the border with Lebanon, as a way to force the Israelis to not be able to use their full military might on the people of Gaza. And so they successfully pulled about 30% of Israeli military resources into the Northern Front, as the Israelis called it, which, quite honestly, I mean, we saw the death and devastation. Imagine what Gaza would have looked like if they had 30% more ability in Gaza. And Hezbollah was clear from the beginning. They said that, the northern border will become quiet, so to speak, once there is a ceasefire reached in Gaza. And the Israelis and the Americans, the Europeans have tried for almost a year now to do what they call is delinking the north from the northern border from the genocide in Gaza, and Hezbollah has refused and continues to refuse to delink it. And so they were involved in this this battle and this skirmish, and the Israelis now, with clearly American blessing and green light, have now turned their attention and focused north, and now expanded the war into, what the Israelis essentially have done is open full-scale war on the Lebanese. And just 2, 3 days ago, announced the Israeli Defense Forces announced a ground invasion in Lebanon, but they have been unsuccessful so far in being able to actually invade any land in a real way in Lebanon. Um, Sorry.
No, no, that's good. So some of this is, I mean, leading up to this, there was a number of things. There was assassinations of a
Yeah,
whole slew of leaders, not just of Hezbollah, but with other forces that were going on. They had this thing with the pagers that exploded,
right.
and there's been sporadic bombing back and forth for some time. So this is but I mean, so far, I mean, this won't be the first time Israel's invaded Lebanon, but it'll, as you mentioned, but but so far they haven't been successful either. It's been a difficult place for them. But they're the aggressors here, in my view. So
Absolutely. Yeah. And
you know
I
what's maybe I'm going back to trying to figure out their motivations here too. I mean, of trying to expand the war when into a place where they've had difficulty in the past. I mean,
yeah.
Gaza is, they've had Gaza under siege for many years, and so they had the upper hand militarily, and certainly
Yeah.
their military hardware is, second to none in the region. But maybe if you could comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, so the Israelis, I think that this is really important, is that especially for us in the United States, is that we talked about what their motivations in Gaza are, but the Israelis themselves have said they want to remake the Middle East, right? They want to do away with anyone who opposes their vision for what the Middle East can look like. And if we look at Israel's friends in the region, it's backwards, right-wing, corrupt monarchies and dictatorships like the United Arab Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, like Morocco. Excuse me. And so they want more of that and less of countries or movements that are responsive to what people actually need or want in the region, right? In addition to their kind of expansionism and goal of ethnically cleansing and committing genocide against the Palestinian people. So specifically in Lebanon, it's clear that the United States gave them a green light to use US bombs and US military hardware to inflict as much damage as they could, not only into Hezbollah as a military and political organization, but through what the Israelis themselves call the Dahiya doctrine, which is to intentionally destroy massive amounts of civilian infrastructure as a form of collective punishment, as a way to drive people away from supporting military resistance to the Israelis. And the Israelis themselves say this, openly. And so this is what they've done. They've killed almost 2,000 people as of today. The Ministry of Health in Lebanon, it's over 1,900 people. Um, and in these quote unquote targeted assassinations, they include the deaths of hundreds of civilians. And so if I could just give an example, I think the most famous one is the leader of Hezbollah since the early 90s is named Hassan Nasrallah. And he's kind of this like very big, very grand figure. Everyone is revered politically in the region. known for his like powerful speeches and all of these things. But he also took Hezbollah. He took them. He built their strength from an organization that successfully destroyed the Israeli occupation in 2000, successfully fended off the Israeli incursion in 2006, and to this powerhouse in the region, right? And the Israelis assassinated him. Um, just last week, I believe it was. I can't remember dates right now. But the important thing about that assassination is it was carried out with U.S. supplied fighter jets, U.S. supplied bunker buster bombs, in which they eviscerated 6 residential buildings by dropping over 80 tons of bombs on them, and killed hundreds of people in hopes of killing one person. And they were successful. And so this is by all, just to like pause and reflect for a moment, this is by all legal, moral definitions a war crime. You're not allowed to go in and kill 300, 400 people in hopes of achieving a success in targeting a military target. Otherwise, if that's what the rules of war become, we can imagine how terrible it would be, right? So this was long ago established that you're not allowed to just eviscerate civilian population centers in hopes of um, striking military targets. But this is what the Israelis did. And again, with the blessing of the United States and with US weapons. And so they successfully assassinated Nasrallah. They killed over 300 people. They completely destroyed, like in a flash of an eye, 6 full residential towers with their residents inside of them, children, women, elderly, men, everyone. Um, and then
I
from
mean, just to
there,
say, I mean, this is a war crime for sure, but it's a war. I mean, the rules of war have been set up, by the British initially, and then the
absolutely,
United States. And so,
right.
as the main superpower in the world, from whatever, we're approaching a century now, and so this is exposing, I think, the United States as well, for them to agree to this, and to to not raise any objections to it. I mean, and what you just said, I mean,
And to
I'm
celebrate
sure
it,
it's
of
happened
course.
for a long time, but for decades and decades, there would be at least some sort of oh no, we didn't really do that. And now they're just like, brazenly saying we're using assassination, and in fact will go so far as to kill, scores and scores of people,
Right.
just to assassinate one person.
And
Um,
this
uh,
is the I'm sorry, I just want to
no,
add
please.
this this is specifically the military strategy that they've employed in Gaza as well, which is to say they will have intelligence of a Hamas leader or another resistance leader in an area. Most recently, just 2 months ago, they a they bombed an area of displaced people that were in tents, incinerating and eviscerating them. Over 200 people killed, allegedly to kill, one of the military leaders of Hamas who was not even there, right? Um, and again, I say allegedly because it is only the Israelis who ever claim that there is some kind of military target amongst these civilian populations. It's clearly what it is just mass casualty events, um, as part of their broader strategy of killing as many people as possible, collective punishment, and taking the opportunity to do so. And so they brought that doctrine into Lebanon. And so for 2 weeks now, we've seen the ratcheting up of this like massive Israeli bombing campaigns, that have killed, as I said, almost 2,000 people now. And that's where we are today. The Israelis have done all of this to say that they are going to return the settlers to the north of historic Palestine that have been evacuated as a result of Hezbollah's engagement with the Israeli military in the north. And Hezbollah has said clearly that we will not stop our military engagement until there is a ceasefire and an end to the genocide in Gaza. And so the Israelis have said that they're going to kill as many people, destroy as many buildings, decimate as much infrastructure as they can as a way to force Hezbollah to stop. Hezbollah has said that they will not stop, and this is where we are today. Um, Literally, it's October 3rd right now. The breaking news is coming out every moment in which, elite commando units from the Israelis are engaging in fierce clashes with Hezbollah commando units on uh, on Lebanese territory or in attempts to breach Lebanese territory. This is happening, as we speak. Um, and so this is what's unfolding now. And I think the other piece of it too that I'll just not to monologue here, but the other piece of it is another person who was killed in this attack against the civilian center that killed Nasrallah was a high-ranking member of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The man who was what they call in charge of the Lebanon file, right? The one who works and coordinates with the resistance like Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so it was not only a war crime, not only not only a war crime, not only a horrific war crime at that, but also an attack on a sovereign country. It's again, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that generally it's frowned upon to go out and bomb and kill members of other sovereign governments. Those are, by all means, by any rationality, considered a declaration of war.
So yeah, I want to get to Iran here a little bit too, and there's two parts to this, and you've brought it up, so this is a good bridge. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
One is as we're talking here, there's Iran has just launched a major bombing attack well into Israel, and this is quite different or different in many ways than the previous drone attack
yeah,
that they had done. And so I want to ask a little bit first about the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran, which people,
yeah,
some the Israelis and some of the much of the American press will say, oh, they're just Hezbollah is just a bunch of flunkies for Iran, and they're just
right, right.
proxies. So if you could speak to that a little bit, but then also talking about Iran, what's their interest in this, and why did they launch this bombing attack? I mean, clearly they're whatever they're poking at a major military power in the region, the major military power in the region.
Yeah. So to the first point in terms of what's the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah, the United States and Israel and their allies incorrectly say that Hezbollah is nothing more than an Iranian proxy, right? They that there's like tens of thousands of fighters who are waiting for some Iranian general to tell them, go forward, go backward, strike here, don't strike there. Nothing could be further from the truth. As I mentioned earlier, Hezbollah is a social, political, military movement that is rooted in Lebanon, um, built in Lebanon, anchored in Lebanon. Their base is all Lebanese. Like this is the key to understand. Iran provides them with military and financial assistance, absolutely. But they are not a proxy of Iran. They are not simply an extension of the Iranian government. That would be incorrect. And so they're allies with Iran. And there's on like a little bit of a higher level, the leadership of Hezbollah, the political, spiritual leadership of Hezbollah believes in the political and spiritual program that the Islamic Republic of Iran puts forward. Um, However, they clearly say that is, that while they believe in this program or while they believe in this kind of political process of this like Islamic Republic that Iran has, that they acknowledge and understand that it is a different context in Lebanon. And so the other piece that I just want to share because I think it's so important is that again, one of the lies that are told, for example, is that like Hezbollah wants to conquer all of Lebanon and turn it into the Islamic Republic of Iran Jr., which is again not true. Hezbollah, all of their political leaders and their military leaders have said clearly that yes, we have a particular political vision, and we understand that we need to engage in a political process that is multilateral, multi-sectarian, multifaceted in Lebanon. And so we know that we don't get to establish an Islamic State because Lebanon is not, that is not what is able to be done in a multi-sectarian society, the multifaceted society like Lebanon. So just those two pieces that are really clear to just make clear that while they, yes, have a financial and military relationship with Iran, absolutely not a proxy of Iran in the way that they are painted by the West and Israel, and instead rather more of an ally of Iran in the region.
So thank you for that. I think that was very helpful, and I think a lot of people don't understand what you just said. So thank you for that. I want to go back to the issue of the Iran
Yep.
offensive
Yeah.
that happened recently, and what their motivations were for bombing Israel. And
Yeah.
maybe I mean maybe by the time this airs, will Israel will have responded as well. But if you want to say anything
Yeah.
about the potential escalation in the region.
Yeah. So Israel has over the last historically has repeatedly violated the sovereignty of Iran. And I talked about this a little bit. So historically, for example, a few years ago, Iran had started a nuclear program for nuclear power, right? Which, by all intents and purposes, again, under like the alleged international system that we all live in, every country is allowed to develop peaceful nuclear power, right? So in coordination with the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, and all of these international bodies, they developed a nuclear power program. Israel wasn't intent on declaring that they are actually developing a nuclear weapons program and had carried out a string of assassinations against top Iranian scientists and government officials that were responsible for the Iranian nuclear program. So that's just a little bit of history, right? And then specifically in this last year, Israel has carried out multiple bombings in which they've killed representatives of the government of Iran. Kind of most famously, maybe, is they killed an Iranian diplomat by bombing a consulate building in Damascus, Syria. And again, in by any legal definition or legal understanding, uh, and I'm sure it would come as no surprise to anyone, bombing another country's consulate is considered an act of war. Consulates are sovereign territory of other countries, right? And so if any country were to bomb another country's consulate in the United States, for example, let's just say hypothetically, that country A bombs the consulate of country B in the United States, that's considered an act of war. It's considered a declaration of war because those are sovereign territory within the United States of those other countries. So Israel had killed multiple heads of the Iranian government, or multiple members, excuse me, of the Iranian government. They had bombed sovereign Iranian territory directly. And then, kind of maybe most famously, is they assassinated the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, while he was on an official state visit um, as an official state guest in Iran. And so they violated the sovereignty of Iran and then killed someone that was a state guest of Iran inside of Iranian borders. And so all of these are multiple, not only escalations, but multiple declarations of war. And the Iranians said very clearly, we are going to respond to all of these things. Now, what's interesting and what's important, I think, for everyone to understand is the Iranian government themselves openly said, it has now come to light, that it was told to them by mediators between them and the West, that the West said, hold off on responding to these violations because we're very close to a ceasefire we're very close to a ceasefire in Gaza. And we don't want Iran to derail a ceasefire that will stop the genocide in Gaza. And the Iranians said, all right, we'll wait. We'll allow this process to go forward. Now, what we all know now, by the admission of the United States government itself, is that that was a lie. Um, the Palestinians had agreed to a ceasefire in July. The Israelis, even though that the Biden administration said over and over, the Israelis are just waiting for the Palestinians, the Israelis actually hadn't agreed. And the Israelis repeatedly derailed by adding more conditions and more conditions and more conditions that they knew the Palestinians wouldn't accept. And so, even though the Palestinians had accepted a ceasefire, the Israelis were delaying a ceasefire. So, that comes to light. There's the assassination of Nasrallah and a high ranking Iranian Revolutionary Guard member And so the Iranian government decides, well, we're going to respond now. And you had mentioned, Richard, that a few months ago, Iran carried out kind of this like limited strike in which they sent a few hundred drones or maybe a few thousand drones and a couple hypersonic missiles as kind of a symbolic strike against Israel to say, we have the capability to strike Israel, right? Um, well, this time around, it wasn't symbolic. So they sent between 200 to 400 missiles, mostly hypersonic missiles, all targeted at Israeli military infrastructure. And the Iranians themselves said that 90% of their missiles hit. And so it was a devastating blow against Israel's military infrastructure. The Israelis have denied it, of course, and the Pentagon has denied it, of course, trying to cover that Iran was able to successfully strike Israel. Um, and then the Iranians said very clearly, they communicated through the United Nations. They said, we acted as the United Nations Charter allows us to in self-defense against declarations of war on our sovereign country by the Israelis, and we consider our response to be complete. And they added then, if the Israelis continue their adventurism, continue their attacks, or respond against Iran, then we will continue to respond. And so we're seeing that with every Israeli attack, not only does the response get, um, bigger, maybe is one way to put it, or more powerful, but we're getting closer and closer and closer to a full-scale regional war that has the potential to drag all different kinds of world powers into it. The United States, of course, but we don't know. I don't think anyone is able to say what countries that are close allies with Iran, like China and Russia, will do. I don't believe that they are going to allow the government of Iran to collapse and be destroyed. Not to say that that would be an easy thing or not easy thing or whatever. But in an instance of full-scale war that involves the government of Iran, I don't think anyone is able to say that it won't escalate beyond just the region. So we should be clear that like the Israelis and the Americans are really playing with fire here in an unknown way. And sorry to monologue, but I think just to return to the
You're
original
the guest. You're
basis, right?
supposed to monologue. You're doing a good job, Muhammad. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Just to
Keep giving
return
us the
to the
knowledge.
original basis here, that the entire reason we are where we are is because Israel does not want to end its genocide against the Palestinian people. If they were to end the genocide against the people of Palestine, we're not even talking about the broader demands around national liberation and justice for the Palestinian people. We're talking about ending this genocide against the Palestinian people. If the Israelis ended their genocide right now, there would be no regional war. There would be no further strikes from Iran. There would be no further strikes from Hezbollah. There would be no further strikes from Ansarullah, the Yemeni government. All of this would end. But the reason why they're willing to kill so many people and drag so much of the region into danger is just to continue their genocide against the Palestinian people. It's a very kind of dark level of sickness of this genocidal regime that they are willing to bomb thousands and kill thousands and drag the entire world into a war just so that they do not have to stop killing the Palestinians. And that's the reality of where we're at. And that's the reality of what the American government is supporting. Our
Let,
government
let me
continues to
ask you
give them
about
the
that a
green
little
light.
bit because there's some people will say over here, well, Netanyahu and some of his cronies are nuts, but
Yeah.
they'll absolve the United States and say that they're not players in this. And
Uh-huh.
we had Hatem Abadeh on here our last episode, and he talked a bit about that's the tail is not wagging the dog.
Right.
That in fact the United States is the major player here. Could you speak
Yes.
to that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, the reality is that Israel as a country, let's just look at Israel as a military power. Israel as a military power would collapse overnight were it not for limitless military aid by the United States. The United States has flown over 200 military supply missions to the Israelis. since the start of this genocide, right? Since October 7th. We've provided hundreds of billions of dollars in military aid. Again, limitless by all intents and purposes, right? And all of this has been done with, totally carte blanche, right? All of this has been done with no expectation of anything, so to speak, in return, right? And that is because the United States is supporting unequivocally what Israel has set out to do, because Israel has set out to do it at the behest of U.S. interest in the region, which is to quote unquote remake the region, destroy anyone that is opposed to U.S. interest in the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Nasrallah in Yemen, the Syrian government, the Iranian government, the Palestinian resistance, anyone that is opposed to U.S. and U.S. hegemony in the region. Israel is the attack dog for the United States. And it's again proven by the fact that Israel again would collapse immediately were it not propped up financially, militarily, and politically by the US. So the only thing that we can, the only thing that we can understand from that is that the US is supporting what Israel is doing in the region. The other thing is, regardless of what lip service the Biden administration or the Kamala Harris as a candidate says publicly, actions are what matter. And so we know that again by the admission of the United States government itself, there is no there is no working tirelessly for a ceasefire. There is no ceasefire resolution end to the genocide about to happen. All of that has been total BS. And in fact, what it is the U.S. allowing the Israelis to buy as much time to continue to commit war crimes and continue to commit massacres. And we need to understand that as because they are acting out the interests of the United States in the region, which is get rid of anyone and get rid of any political power that opposes U.S. hegemony and opposes U.S. influence and power in the region.
Yes. So yeah, and I think that's what you see there too in the region is the ones that are resisting, Iran, Hezbollah, whatever, Yemen, to some extent Syria, are people that have not just been acquiescing to the US's role in the region. So I want
Absolutely.
to turn a little bit to the protest movement and the resistance here in the United States. And some of the demands have been along the lines of what you're talking about. End all aid to Israel was our demand at the Democratic National
Right.
Convention. Some of the trade unions here in the United States, and this is a big deal, I think, too, because I come from the labor movement. U.S. labor does not break with State Department policy, at least not since the McCarthy days very often,
Right.
and there
Right.
was a couple of unions during Vietnam, but it was rare. And so to see, the service employees, the painters union, some of the National Education Association,
Yep.
the United Electrical Workers. I'm missing some. I shouldn't have started listing them, but there were 7 unions that called for the end of military aid to
Right.
Israel, and while it's maybe not going far enough, it's a huge deal
Oh
to
yeah, yeah,
see
absolutely.
labor unions do that. And the students. Could you speak a little bit to BDS? Could you speak a little bit to the resistance in the United States over the last year, and where are we at right now, and what are next steps for the resistance? I know you're a leader of that. You're part of that. I see you speak at the protests here in Chicago, and eloquently, I might add. But
Thank you.
it's yeah, but it's could you talk a little bit about what we're doing here?
Yeah, so I think that the key piece that you talked about, or the piece that you talked about is so key, right? Which is that um, just to like zoom out a little bit, if we just talk about what the popular will of people in the United States is, over 60% of people want to see an immediate ceasefire. Um, when you talk about like people in general, right, in the United States, when you talk about different political parties, when you talk about the Democratic Party, it's almost 80% of Democratic Party, people who self-identify the Democratic Party that want to see a ceasefire. When you talk about young people, We're talking about 40 to 50% of young people want to see an immediate end to all aid to Israel. This is like people under 26, right? When we talk about Democratic Party, people who align with the Democratic Party in general, you're talking about 30 to 40% of people who want to see an end to military aid of Israel. So we're really like our movement actually represents the popular will of people in the United States. Um, and from the beginning was to end U.S. support for Israeli genocide, right? Um, and to end military aid and to end all aid eventually to Israel, right? Amongst other things. The demand continues now to be made. I think most importantly, the demand continues now to be made to end in the immediate, end all military aid, at least to Israel, right? As I said before, and I'll continue to say it again because I think it's so important. Israel as a military power would collapse overnight were it not for US support, right? Were it not for unlimited US resources. Israel would not be able to sustain, forget a multi-front war. Israel wouldn't be able to sustain against the starved, encircled population of Gaza, were it not for unlimited US support. The resistance in Gaza has achieved, just as a objective, like from a objective military standpoint, I'm not a military analyst, but anyone has achieved, in what no one had ever imagined would be achievable by a starved, encircled population against the largest military force in the region and, the third or fourth largest in the world. Um, and so our demand here and our role here is to demand that the United States ends its military aid to Israel, because that's what will end this genocide against the Palestinian people. Um, I think that the reality is that it's been a very difficult and uphill battle because, as we spoke about, Israel is acting out the will of the United States government for the region. And that's the reality of what our movement is coming up against. And so I think that the like chipping away of this, like you talked about in the labor movement and in these other areas, these other sectors, is so important, because people are starting to recognize like what is our government actually doing abroad? And more importantly, like how is it affecting us here at home, right? Um, and there's always been this kind of like, yeah, one of the slogans, right, is like, end military aid, spend the money here. But we're talking about $200 billion if we just look at $200 billion of aid to Israel, and if we just look at the devastation of the hurricanes that's happening across the southeast of the United States, I think everyone would be able to say, yeah, we have a better place to spend $200 billion, right? Um, Aside from even just moral and ethical questions of limitless war and limitless carnage and limitless killing. And so I think that our role in the United States is continue to escalate in all places that we can against those who are one profiteering off this war, because there are a lot of people making a lot of money, right? The other thing that I think is important to understand about US aid is it's not like we like send a suitcase full of money to the Israelis and say, go buy a plane. The US aid that the United States provides to Israel is oftentimes spent in Americans' arms manufacturers and American weapons manufacturers and then shipped to the Israelis. And so there's a lot of money to be made on this military aid industrial complex, maybe if we want to call it that, in which the United States government is taking money, buying weapons from US weapons manufacturers and sending it to the Israelis. There's a lot of money to be made here. And so I think that we've seen a lot of people starting to focus on how do we disrupt this? How do we challenge this? At the same time that we focus on our political leaders to demand an end to the genocide. And ultimately, I think here on this podcast, we're amongst friends. And I think the reality that we have very important work to do in the United States. But the reality is that this is multifaceted. And the reality on the ground in terms of what the resistance is able to achieve in Gaza and what they're able to achieve in Lebanon, what they're able to achieve in other places, is what's also going to force the hand of US lawmakers here. The United States will react and will respond, and will be forced to react and respond to the reality of the military situation on the ground. And if Israel begins to lose massively, continues to lose massively in Lebanon and other places, then we'll see, I believe, US lawmakers say, okay, we need a change in this policy right now.
Yeah. So I want to, that's helpful. Thank you. I want to move to some of the repression that we've seen
Yeah,
here in the United States as well. And the whatever, again, the press and the Zionists locally will say, talk about the anti-Semitism and is
yeah,
on the increase and all of this, but there's also been a cost for some people just for being Palestinian in some cases or for standing up. And then in other cases, people, you know, who took a stand, who like some of the students at the encampments or whatever. Can you
right.
talk a little bit about the excuse me, the repression here in the United States of people because of this war?
Yeah, well, I think that I'd like to think about it kind of in three areas. The first, I think, is the first and most visceral and most the first most visceral and the most awful is the physical attacks that have led to permanent injury and death of Palestinians in the U.S. We're in Chicago, and right here in the Chicagoland area, very early on, a young boy, 6 years old, and his mother, the 6 year old, was killed because he was stabbed numerous amounts of times by their white landlord, who was watching this steady stream of US mainstream news, who actually had a relationship with this family. But US news is so ingrained as this disgusting, racist, anti-Palestinian constant stream that he took a knife, went up to their apartment, stabbed and killed this young man. And when his mother tried to intervene, stabbed her multiple times as well. His mother, the young boy's mother, Wadia's mother, survived, but unfortunately, Wadia was killed. And just a few months later, we see that there are three young Palestinian men on the East Coast who are walking, wearing keffiyehs and maybe Palestine shirts, and a white racist opens fire, excuse me, on them. And one of these young men is now permanently disabled for the rest of his life. Will never walk again. Um, and I think this is the cutting edge of what, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about this as a reality as well, of the horrific violence that Palestinians, Arabs are facing now as a result of this propaganda campaign. Um, and there are numerous other stories, right? Like a woman who tries to drown Palestinian children in a Texas pool most recently, and all of these other things, right? And this is, again, a result of just this steady diet of racism in the mainstream press in the United States. Then there's another layer, right? Which is the repression by these private entities like universities, jobs, and others, where people who are daring to speak up for Palestine are being punished with their livelihood, right? Students, graduate students, or other students at encampments, University of Chicago withheld people's diplomas, right? There are students all across the country who uh, lost years of study because they took a stand around Palestine, right? The Senate, unanimously passed a declaration that said that Students for Justice in Palestine essentially is a wing of Hamas. And so what kind of repression does that lay the foundation for? And then the third piece that I think is also just as important, and this is something that, those of us in the Palestine movement are really like looking at and intent on right now because we think this is the next up and coming wave. There's a slew of civil lawsuits that have been filed against Palestine organizers and Palestinian activists. And these are just like smear lawsuits, right? And the idea is you write a 60-page civil lawsuit that says, you know, Muhammad is a member of USPCN, and USPCN is a front for Hamas, and they're a foreign designated terrorist organization, and because of that, I'm suing them for damages and blah 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 blah, right? And most of these are what we call nuisance lawsuits, right? People file these things just that you get caught up in court and you have to fight them off, and it sucks your resources and sucks your time and energy and all of these sorts of things, right? But the other piece of it that's really important, and this was kind of brought to my attention by the brilliant legal mind Michael Deutsch, the brilliant and iconic attorney, movement attorney, is that one of the strategies here is if you can force people into depositions and um, into discovery through civil lawsuits, you can then that can then be used to bring criminal charges by the state against activists. And I, without a doubt, believe that we are going to see a wave of repression from the state against Palestine, the Palestine movement, as soon as this phase of the struggle in Palestine is over, that it'll turn inwards. Um, and these civil lawsuits then potentially, have the danger of laying a foundation in which the state will come in and come after Palestine organizing and Palestine activists, as we'd seen in the Midwest 23 case, as we'd seen in the Rasmi Auda case, as we've seen before that with Dr. Samin Arian and Abdul Halim al-Ashqar and the Holy Land Five and Muhammad Salah, and there's every era of the Palestine movement has its
So this has
repression
been,
in
you've
the
been
United
naming people that
States.
have been decades and decades
Right.
of repression against people that have been spoken out for Palestine.
Yeah, leaders in
Case of
Palestine
Rasmi
organizing.
Oda, who was actually even deported from Chicago, and
Yeah,
was a good friend of ours,
right.
and part of your organization.
Yeah, one of my dearest mentors. So every era has its its repression, and I believe that we maybe are on the precipice of another wave of repression in this country. And another piece too that I think is really important to mention to folks that we're starting to see as well, is that Zionists, this is kind of in the civil realm. Zionists are very intently using a strategy now to deplatform Palestine organizing and Palestine organizations from being able to handle money. And so I could talk about USPCN, for example, is we've been delisted by multiple donation platforms, PayPal, Stripe, Square, others, without any kind of due process because they're all private entities. And they could just give you the finger and say, go somewhere else. It's not our problem. And this is because of coordinated Zionist pressure. And so they come and they say they'll send a scary sounding letter to a payment processor or to a bank or to another financial institution and say, hey, these people in Hamas and designated terrorism, and you're going to be liable and you're whatever. And these payment processors and banks and and um and fiscal sponsors and all this whole world will drop people, right? And it's important, right? Like our work and our organizing takes money, um, and takes resources. And to be able to collect donations from people and spend money, you need to exist in the financial world of the United States. And so this is a very, again, this is kind of like a cutting edge of what the Zionist movement in the US is trying to do as a way to affect Palestine organizing by cutting them off from their ability to receive and spend money. And so this is another piece of the repression that is affecting a lot of the lead organizations across the country right now.
I want to move a little bit here to the international support, and we don't have time to go over every country or whatever, but
Yeah,
just in broad strokes, the since October 7th, the movement for justice in Palestine has people have seen the genocide, and it's grown. Can you talk a little bit about world public opinion, and the how this movement, even I know, I was in the Olympics, the Moroccan soccer team and other things just
yeah,
captured the imagination. I've seen soccer's I'm a sports fan, I guess, but
me
in
too.
Scotland, the team Celtic, I
The
saw they had
Celtics,
like
yeah,
the hundreds, and I mean thousands maybe, of Palestinian flags and chanting.
yeah.
I'm like, oh my God. And there's many examples like this. I just gave a couple, but if you could talk a little bit about the support, which I think was always there, but it's just because of the genocide, it's become much louder, and it's bigger, I think, too. So if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of two layers. One is that like there's been states that have taken unprecedented action that we as a movement, owe so much to, like South Africa and Colombia and other countries that, South Africa started the case in the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, charging Israel with genocide. And so many other countries have come on from across Latin America, across the third world, the Arab world to as well. But South Africa led the charge, saying we know what's happening, and we are going to take the onus to do what we can to end it. And again, I think that we as a Palestinian people, we as the Arab people are, indebted to them forever for taking this stance. But I think it speaks to the principles that drive this alternative to the international system that we live in now. There's an international order now, not to get too philosophical, that we see in which Israel is committing genocide backed unlimitedly by Europe and the United States. And people who were formerly colonized and people who are oppressed are identifying what's happening and saying we need to band together because this way of doing things, this old world in which Europe and the US comes and dominates and kills and takes over land and does whatever they want to do needs to end. And the way to do that is to band together and to challenge this system in whatever way that we can, whether it's the UN, the international court system, et cetera, et cetera. And they're paying a heavy price for it. The United States now is threatening sanctions on South Africa because they had the audacity to stand up to the Israeli genocide. So that's one level, I believe. And then the other level, I think, that you spoke about, which, to be frank, I believe has always been the case, which is that all people who care about justice and all people who care about human rights and all people who care about all sorts of things have always identified with the Palestinian people and the righteous Palestinian struggle. And we're seeing that all over the world now. I think we're in a moment in which it's a lot easier to communicate and show. You talked about like the Celtic team in Scotland. They're like known as the Palestine has been their symbol for years, right? To the point in which I remember a few years ago, that they were threatened, I believe it was UEFA, threatened them with a fine if they would to display the Palestinian flag. And they did two things. Is one, they got all of their supporters to bring extra flags that game. And then the second thing is they matched the fine in donations to the people of Gaza. As kind of an FU to this corrupt governing body of European football. And so I think that that's been very powerful, right? And we've seen so much, whether it's sports or whether it's the world of art, or it feels like we're at a moment in which not only has everyone recognized what's happening, but people are recognizing that if nothing else, we have a responsibility to do whatever we can in our own kind of capacity. And that's been our message as USPCN for a long time. And it's something that I visited, the last time I went on a political delegation in 2017 to Palestine. We met with like 30 different organizations across the West Bank and historic Palestine. And one of the things that people, when we would ask people, what do you want us to do? One of the things that resonated so much is everyone that we talked to said, do whatever you can. If you're an artist, make art around Palestine. If you're a musician, make music around Palestine. If you dance, do Palestinian folkloric dance. If you are a political activist, organize around Palestine. If you're a teacher, teach about Palestine. If you're a union activist, talk to your union around Palestine. All of these things, we need all of it, right? And if we look at other movements from history, if we look only at the South African anti-apartheid movement, I think that in this country, in the United States, that's such a good example, right? Where it was the people of the United States and the institutions and the different sectors, whether it was labor or artists or academics, were eons ahead of our government. And actually, our government was dragged kicking and screaming into ending its support of apartheid. And that is what we're going to have to do again in the US. The US government is going to have to be dragged kicking and screaming by the popular movement in this country into ending their support of the genocide of the Palestinian people and ending their support of the racist, right-wing, white settler colonial state of Israel. And the way that we do that is all of us, all of us engaging in our capacity in whatever it is in the world that we know of in that struggle. And so, just to, again, I'm not, for example, I'm not a union activist, but obviously I think we all identify how important unions are in this country still, how important the labor movement is in this country still, and how for the last few years we've seen, at least in my lifetime, unprecedented wins and um, unprecedented militancy of the labor movement. And seeing that now come to fruition around Palestine, I think really, really, really can't be downplayed, you know. Um, even if it's, and you should correct me if I'm wrong here, Richard, right? But even if it's bullshit, the Democratic Party, for example, can't go out and say we don't believe in labor unions. They have to throw this bone to this idea of unions, right? Or like Biden, this is stuck in my mind because of the longshore workers strike. You know, someone asked Biden about Taft-Hartley, and Biden said, "I don't believe in Taft-Hartley," right? And it's not because he's this like amazing revolutionary labor organizer, right? But because the he's recognizing the moment that he's in. He's not dumb. He's recognizing the moment that we're in, and he's recognizing what this means. And so we also need to recognize that. And we need to raise our struggle, and we need to raise the consciousness of our struggle on that next level amongst everyday working people, amongst people who are not professional activists, because that is what's going to allow us to play our role in helping the Palestinian people liberate themselves.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, I like the Frederick Douglass quote, the abolitionist, who said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand," and
Exactly.
never did, never will. And that's what you just said about the ruling parties here. Um, but let me, unfortunately, our time is winding down here. But yeah, you've been a fabulous guest. I want
Thank
to
you.
give you a chance if there's anything that we didn't cover here that you want to add, or any points you want to make, or parting words for our Fight Back Radio listeners.
Yeah, well, one thing that I would ask folks to look at now to take concrete steps is, Senator Sanders has put forward a resolution in the Senate that would stop the next $20 billion of military aid being sent to Israel. And again, this is the floor, it's not the ceiling, right? This isn't like some crazy revolutionary act, but we need to fight like hell for everything that we can get and then shift the needle so that the next thing we get is more radical than the last. And so, what everyone should be doing, I believe, right now, we all need to be fighting to push our senators to say it is time to stop military aid to Israel. And the first step of doing that is signing on to the Sanders resolution. And so, that's one thing that I would ask people to engage with. Um, in an immediate next step. That's one thing that we as USPCN would ask people to engage with in the immediate next step. And the next piece that I'll say is, as difficult as it is in this moment and as difficult as it is 1 year on, we still have a responsibility to continue to escalate our movement and our tactics across this country. Because like we've said so many times before, the United States, if US support for Israel ends, the genocide against the Palestinian people ends. And so we have our task, we have our role. We ask everyone to join us. You can follow us at uspcn.org. You can check us out on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and all the socials. Get involved with USPCN or others. And, hopefully we get to see everyone in the streets. And hopefully we get to not only an end to the genocide, but to the liberation of the Palestinians together.
Okay. Well, thank you, Muhammad Sankari. We'll put all the United States Palestinian Community Network contact stuff into the show notes if people want to reach them there. But thank you so much for being our guest on Fight Back
Thank you.
Radio.
Thanks for having me, Richard. Appreciate it.
Clearly, the Palestinian movement is at the center of the U.S. imperial project right now. And it's important that we be active. It's important that we take this on. It's right now more than ever. People of the world are in motion around the issue of Palestine. as Muhammad told us in this episode, we can see that unions and mass movements are starting to challenge the U.S.'s policy on this, because the genocide is so repugnant, and so many innocent people are dying just to further a Zionist cause that's not in our interest in any case. So I encourage everybody here, get involved. If you're a student, look for the SDS chapter on your campus. You can contact USPCN. They'll help direct you in the right direction. The SJPs, whoever you are, find a march, support the Palestinians. I know there's an election coming up, but this is not the time to be silent on Palestine. This is the time to speak out. This is the time when we can get something done. The Democratic Party has not wanted to move on this, and of course the Republican Party doesn't either. And so they agree. They're one party around imperialism and around Palestine, and we need to push back against that. The way we won in South Africa was the United States, the people of South Africa, the people of the world came together and pushed the imperial policy. As Frank Chapman told us, the United States supported apartheid in South Africa, and they support it in Israel right now. And so we need to fight back against that. I want to thank Muhammad Sankari. I've known Muhammad for many, many years, and he's a fighter. He's out front of the movement and not afraid to say what needs to be said. And I thought he did just a fabulous job here doing that. So thank you, Muhammad. Finally, I want to thank our Fight Back Radio production team, which did a great job as always. Vince Olson, Shane Tremley, Natalie Pranis, and Dodd McColgan. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people.